Hello and welcome to President Trump, the first 100 days in front of a live audience at the Charles Perkins Theatre at the University of Sydney, broadcasting on ABC News and RN in association with the US Studies Centre. I'm John Barron. President Trump tweeted last week that the 100 days yardstick was a, quote, ridiculous standard, although as a candidate, Mr Trump promised a long list of things that he said he would achieve in those first 100 days. The idea of a first 100 days always was a bit of a media confection. Reporters in 1933 first compared the early days of Franklin Roosevelt's administration, when he created the New Deal and the modern welfare state, to Napoleon's 100-day march from exile on Elba to defeat at Waterloo in 1815. So it's fair to say historically a lot can happen in 3 and a bit months. But how does Donald Trump measure up, not just to FDR and Napoleon, but to Carter and Reagan and Clinton, but also to his own promises? We'll look at President Trump's first 100 days with 3 expert panels. Later we'll focus on domestic policy from healthcare to immigration. And we'll look at President Trump's war with the media and talk about the future of the Australia-US alliance with former Ambassador to the United States, Kim Beazley. And soon we'll talk foreign policy and security. But first, a look back on an eventful and controversial 100 days.
So help me God.
My administration is putting an end to the war on coal. We're gonna have clean coal. We must, as a nation, be more unpredictable. We are totally predictable.
North Korea is a big world problem, and it's a problem we have to finally solve.
The President of the United States.
We will soon begin the construction of a great wall along our southern border.
The best way to keep foreign terrorists from attacking our country is to stop them from entering our country in the first place.
Well, let's start our discussion by looking at foreign affairs and security issues. Let's meet our first panellists. First, Gorana Gergich, an expert on US politics and US-Russia relations. She's at the US Studies Centre. Valerie Hudson, an expert on international security and US foreign policy at Texas A&M. Stephen Loosley, a leading Australian commentator on US politics. He's also a former Australian Labor Senator and a visiting fellow at the US Studies Centre. And Ashley Townsend. He specialises in Asian and regional security issues and is also a fellow at the US Studies Centre. Would you please make them welcome? So first to you, Valerie Hudson. Early days, I know, but in the first 100 days, have you seen anything that might be approaching what might be called, one day, a Trump doctrine?
You bet, John. We heard it in the State of the Union address. He said, we reject the path of an inflexible ideology, meaning the Trump doctrine is that we will not be bound by doctrine. So this means we have a situational, more improvisational approach to foreign policy. President Trump has easily reversed his positions. He's also emphasized options. The more, the better. He tends to move on directly after signaling, and he delights in being able to point out when he has done something in foreign policy that is the opposite of what we would presume his predecessor would do.
Stephen Loosley, one of the things that candidate Trump promised to be was unpredictable. Some have interpreted that as meaning perhaps erratic or ill-informed. Has he been unpredictable?
To an extent, yes, and what he's done is to take Richard Nixon's a concept of a madman in the White House from time to time. Nixon used it in negotiations with the North Vietnamese, to a lesser extent with the Soviets and the Chinese, an element of unpredictability, which we saw in the missile strike in Syria, for example, where if you look back 2 or 3 years, when Donald Trump was a private citizen, there were endless tweets criticising Barack Obama in the White House for even contemplating what Trump subsequently did in Syria. So there is that air of unpredictability, and I think you can date that to the Nixon administration.
Gorana Grgic, we have seen the President launch a cruise missile strike on an airbase in Syria in response to a chemical weapons attack. It is reported by the Assad regime, supported by a lot of Western intelligence. We've also seen a lot of sabre rattling around the Korean peninsula. Is that any different to what would have happened, do you think, had Hillary Clinton been elected in November, or if this had happened on Barack Obama's watch? Is there a different response to these events as they happen coming now from the Trump White House?
Well, certainly what we've seen so far from President Trump has been a real emphasis on military solutions. So it seems that all the problems in terms of foreign affairs seem to have a very military solution as opposed to diplomatic or kind of foreign assistance ways. And he signaled that from, as you said, from Middle East to basically to East Asia. But I would say with regards to where he's been in the campaign to where he's at now, it seems that there's been an awful of kind of shift towards the more establishmentarian response, if you wish. A lot of people who weren't cheering for Trump in the early days are now seeing Trump committing way more in Syria or Iraq, which is certainly something that, you know, the hawkish sides of both parties would have been much happier with. And in turn, it has made those who supported Trump in the early days really disappointed with his response, given that he was somewhat of a neo-isolationist.
So on that, Ashley, the idea that some of those, maybe the more libertarian Republicans, that when they heard Donald Trump speak, they heard the parts that were about not intervening. They didn't maybe hear all the stuff about military spending increasing and so on. How disappointed do you think they are right now? Has he sold out to the neocons, as some people are saying?
Well, there has been a rising trend in US domestic politics where the population is simply fed up with American overextension, overengagement worldwide, and that's where the libertarian view comes in. Donald Trump has certainly not shown himself to be an isolationist, and in fact, even prior to the election, he was on the record talking about building up a stronger military, taking a stronger approach, especially to China in East Asia. So of course, there is an element of disappointment there, but at the same time, in the broader Republican Party, people do like to see a president stand firm. The problem with Trump is that he has stood firm in a very illusory way. Sending carrier strike groups to the Korean Peninsula might look tough, but in fact his military options are not there. Even his National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, says that there is no military option being actively discussed.
Valerie Hudson, there are some in Washington who were quite reassured when names like McMaster, Tillerson, James Mattis and so on, the kinds of people that President Trump chose to surround himself in, that these were the wise heads that were going to make up for the fact that here's a man who's never held elected office and has in some ways never grappled with some of these issues. What is your perception of the kind of advice that he is getting and the way that he is responding to these early crises?
I think he's getting good advice. H.R. McMaster, excellent voice. James Mattis, excellent voice here. But I think you see that they've got to explain to him, in a sense, why the direction that he's going in is perhaps not the best. But we do see evidence that he is learning from these mentors. So, for example, the strike on the Syrian airfield. All right, neither McMaster nor Mattis wants to get involved in Syria. So what do you see? You see 59 cruise missiles. You see no damage to the airways. You see 20 planes, count them, 20 planes destroyed. This was a signaling. All right, it was a very deft signaling, but it was signaling nonetheless. And he has quickly moved on from that. You don't see any follow-through with additional strikes and so forth.
Stephen Loosley, could we see a similar strategy employed with North Korea? If we look at the template of Syria, you mark a red line, you cross it with something like chemical weapons, you have a surgical targeted strike, but then you essentially say to the power with the bigger interest, Russia, now you sort it out so we don't have to do that again. Could the same happen in North Korea?
It's possible. The best red line on the Korean Peninsula was drawn by Bill Clinton in his presidency in the middle 90s, when at the time the DPRK was threatening South Korea. And Clinton gave an interview, a public interview, and he said words to this effect, that if the North were to attack South Korea, it would be regarded as an attack upon the United States. And this would mean a full American retaliatory response. And he went on to say, for North Korea, that means the end of their country. Now, it couldn't have been clearer. So, and the crisis passed. There are limited military options in North Korea in terms of an American intervention. If it's going to be resolved over time, it's going to be resolved through a combination, I suspect, of sanctions and diplomacy, and China being able to achieve a result diplomatically, for which the Chinese will ask a price of the United States. Now, if you look at Trump in the campaign, from memory, it was a question on what happens if Japan and North Korea are in a conflict. And he said words to this effect, let them go to it. I mean, that is an entirely different dimension to what we're seeing now. The same as NATO was once obsolete. It no longer is, apparently. And this has been an important role for General Mattis, for Vice President Pence, in terms of reassuring the Allies. So just about anything is possible in terms of Donald Trump's imagination. What then can apply in reality is an entirely different circumstance.
Valerie Hudson, the 10% increase in military spending that President Trump has promised, that $53+ billion, a lot of it coming out of the State Department budget, will that have a material impact on programs that could then affect, further down the line, issues that the United States may have to confront elsewhere in the world?
That's an excellent question, and I think it's important that as deft as Trump is at signaling, deterrence is not enough. Military signaling is not enough. All right, an American president who has some foresight needs to create the conditions for stability and peace in the international system. And by gutting state and USAID, he's pulling his greatest resources in terms of creating those conditions. For example, President Trump has zeroed out the budget for the Office of Global Women's Issues, as in 100% of that budget is gone. It will have zero funding, meaning that positions will go away. There is no greater influence on the stability and security of nations than the situation and security of women within those nations, whether we're talking food security, demographic security, governance, even conflict. Are intimately tied to the situation of women. So by removing the ability to create the conditions for peace and stability, I wonder whether we won't be buying greater problems in the long term.
Stephen Lucy, if as Valerie suggests, with that pulling back of what can be described as soft power in favour of military spending, will allies such as Australia have renewed questions about the nature and the moral underpinning of America's place in the world? Well,
certainly the question that needs an answer from an Australian perspective, and obviously the Prime Minister will raise this with President Trump in New York, is the rebalance towards Asia is the pivot, which actually began under George W. Bush prior to Barack Obama. Is that still American policy insofar as national security in the region is concerned? That really needs to be answered. There are interesting parallels in terms of Trump's thinking on foreign policy, such as it is, with that of the young Theodore Roosevelt, who didn't like international agreements, denounced William Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson for signing them, and worked on the basis of powerful states having spheres of influence and working to maintain a stable international regime through powerful states. And you can see Trump's affection for Vladimir Putin reflected in that. You can see the effusive manner in which he talks about President Xi of China reflected in that. Now, just as Andrew Jackson appears to be the domestic president for whom he finds most favour, the portrait in the White House laying the wreath at his grave and so on, it may be that it's Theodore Roosevelt who serves as the model for the Trump presidency in terms of foreign affairs and defence.
Joanna, can we talk a little about how the rest of the world sees Donald Trump? We've heard a lot in the United States about the ties or otherwise between the Trump campaign and Russia, the extent to which Russia put their finger on the scales during the election last year to help defeat Hillary Clinton. How do you think, though, he is now being viewed in Moscow?
Well, there's certainly been a kind of transition from a lot of love and kind of cheering in the early days, and certainly the signals that were sent when President Putin made Secretary Tillerson wait for a couple of hours before he got an audience with President Putin was telling in regards to what might happen with the whole Russia reset. So certainly it's not what everyone was expecting, that this is going to be the kind of, bromance in power. There's a lot to signal that, things have changed on both sides. And as you said, probably a lot of these investigations that have to do with the potential collusion of some Trump associates and the Kremlin around the 2016 election have to do with it, but also, the strikes in Syria didn't help, and obviously Putin's constant patronage of the Assad regime obviously doesn't help those matters.
Ashley, the Syrian airstrikes, of course, served in a way as being sort of after-dinner entertainment at Mar-a-Lago when President Xi of China was there with President Trump. That meeting seemed to go a lot better than a lot of people were anticipating. Great chemistry and so on, according to President Trump. Do you see that as just a short-term pragmatic, we need them to do something to help us in North Korea? Or in fact, has there been, all the campaign rhetoric aside, have we now seen a big shift in the possible future of the US-China relationship?
I don't think that we have seen yet what the nature of US-China relations will truly be in this administration. I think that the reason for the bromance at Mar-a-Lago between Xi and Trump was that both sides need a degree of stability right now. Xi Jinping is obviously going into the Party Congress later this year and wants stable relations with the United States. Trump needs China's support, or believes he needs China's support on North Korea. Now, that doesn't take away all of the tough stance and tough words that he issued on China in the lead up to the election. We have seen him back off on issues like the South China Sea, back off on issues like trade and currency policy to try and curry favor with Beijing in the hope that by linking trade, a more positive trade relationship to Chinese assistance on North Korea, that China might finally come to the table. This is his deal-maker strand of behavior coming out, and it's not necessarily going to work. It's also not necessarily going to backfire. China may well seek to do a little bit more in pressuring North Korea through sanctions. They may well cut down petroleum exports later this month or next month, but that won't be enough to really ultimately change their calculations on the peninsula. So Trump's deal-making approach, which in his view is really a one-shot game that doesn't necessarily perceive the flow-on effects of iterated relationships over time, could backfire if the Chinese do indeed not do enough to satisfy him, and he then has to walk back this softer tone that was created at Mar-a-Lago.
I'd like to point out, though, that I think that Trump's reversals do not necessarily hurt him with his supporters. Right? And this, I think, is also an interesting hallmark in making the Trump presidency different from previous presidencies. Previous presidents have stuck with policies that were not working well in order to have that consistency, in order to keep on with the grand strategy, or I'm sure Trump would call it the inflexible ideology. But I see Trump actually educating his base. So when he says, I'm not going to call China a currency manipulator, even though I promised you I would call China a currency manipulator. Let me tell you why, right? Which is, number one, since I was inaugurated, they haven't manipulated their currency. And number two, I need them to deal with North Korea, right? And I think that actually plays very well to his base. So the notion that he's going to reverse, I think, is not just a sign of improvisational and transactional, but also it's a way for him to educate his base as to why he's doing what he's doing.
Valerie Hudson, thank you for your insights on that. Would you also thank Garana Gergich, Stephen Loosley and Ashley Townsend? This is President Trump, the first 100 days. In a moment, our attention will shift to domestic politics. But first, let's have a deeper look at the possible implications of a Trump presidency on the Australia-US alliance with former Australian ambassador to the United States, Kim Beazley. Kim Beazley, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
When it comes specifically to the Australia-US relationship, obviously a pretty rocky start with that infamous weekend phone call between our Prime Minister and the new President in late January. Didn't go well, trying to kind of nut out the refugee deal and so on. But with the appointments of Tillerson, Mattis and now McMaster as well, there seems to be at least a sort of veneer of normalcy being restored.
To a degree, one has to feel a certain sort of empathy with Trump's position when he looks at that agreement that we arrived with the Obama administration. It's a bit of a shock. It was a very generous position that Obama adopted, and that Trump would object to that it comes as no surprise. But the government had to hold the line, and the government did hold the line on it. Look, I think that in a sense, he's a pretty easy administration for Australia to deal with. It may not be optimal in the terms of the way in which we see the globe, but there is nothing in our relationship with the United States that he would find a matter that is to be critical. The way in which he sees the world, which is in sort of basically functional material terms, not the world of ideas and moral commitments, the Australian relationship looks pretty good to him. So we don't have many challenges in that sense. Our challenge is how he relates to the region around us, which is important to us, how he relates to China in particular. And that's for our time, for the time of his presidency, that's going to be a constant challenge for us. How are our friends doing? What can we do to help them?
Of course, for the voters in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan that sent him there to make America great again, how do you think he is going with them? He hasn't had a great record so far. Healthcare sort of stumbled at the first hurdle. A few executive orders have been tangled up in the courts. Lots of process stories about chaos in the White House and so on.
I think they're a bit blind to it. I mean, if you take the collective wealth of his cabinet, it constitutes about 80% of the wealth of the various counties that actually voted for him. I mean, it's truly extraordinary. The plutocracies had a fair run in the appointments, but I think as yet the value added he gave to the Republican Party by bringing the sort of white working class base into it, particularly in the Rust Belt states, they will not yet have been disappointed in what he's delivered, because the sort of, if you like, the star items, the efforts on immigration that have faltered, the efforts on health which have faltered, they're not been terribly important, or they've been empathetic with him in what he's been attempting to do. Like, it wasn't immediately obvious to his basic constituency, his new constituency, that if he'd got the healthcare legislation through that he wanted to, they would have been crippled. They would have found that out if that legislation had gone through, but not having gone through, there's a really strong preparedness amongst that small group to give him a go.
Did we learn from the failure of the healthcare legislation, that this notion of unified Republican government really doesn't exist, and that we're potentially looking at, just as we did under Obama, a significant period of congressional gridlock?
You know, I think the most important thing out of the healthcare thing, and I think it's been amplified by other things as well, responses to his trade initiatives and that sort of thing, that the Republican Party is losing their fear of him. The freedom of caucus in the health debate completely lost their fear of Trump. Now, the idea that Trump would come in and campaign in their constituencies against them in their primaries, the response of the average Freedom Caucus member is, bring it on. They're totally confident that they represent the views of their constituents, and they were happy to deliver to Trump a vote at the end of the spectrum where he was faltering amongst traditional Republican supporters.
Can we draw conclusions about what that election actually meant? Was it the reassertion of the white working class of the United States, or is that sort of, nationalistic, populistic sort of message that was seen to prevail been overstated?
What they have taken is a massive hit on their status as breadwinners and their status as earners, and this was their revolt. This was, in many ways, a very Australian revolt. Now, for Americans, freedom is hardwired in their minds. For Australians, fairness is hardwired in our minds. And for the American white working class, life has not been fair. And they have made a statement. And the statement they made might have what to many of us seems like a ludicrous result, with a billionaire, unsystematic social thinker made the President of the United States. But in many ways, many of them will feel that they have reclaimed territory. They have reclaimed honour. They will shift off Trump very slowly.
Kim Beazley, thanks for joining us. You're watching President Trump, the first 100 days on ABC News and on ABC Radio National. I'm John Barron. Great to have you with us. Well, if in foreign policy the President has almost unfettered powers up to and including launching a nuclear strike if they feel so inclined, it's in the domestic realm that there are pesky things like the Congress and the courts, not to mention protesters, who will sometimes get in the way. So now we turn our attention to the home front. How is the Donald doing? Let's welcome our domestic panellists. First, Barbara Heinbach, former Carter White House press officer. Great to see you, Barb. The CEO of the US Studies Centre and expert on many things, including opinion polling and elections, Professor Simon Jackman. Economics correspondent at The Australian, Adam Crichton, who is recently back from a 6-month stint at the Wall Street Journal. And the editor of the New York Times in Australia. Welcome to Damien Cave. Would you welcome them all? Now, Barb Heinbach, I want to start with you on this because we talked a lot about the Trump campaign last year, and you were one of a relative handful of pundits that could really see him coming as a serious candidate to take on Hillary Clinton, who you've known for a long, long time. So you've got a sense of the kinds of people that supported Donald Trump. Do you have a sense now, after 100 days, how they're feeling? Has he delivered? Is he the president they elected?
Couple of things. He has not delivered on the promises that he made that he was going to take care of within the first 100 days. On that, we'd have to fail him for sure. However, he has started up and gotten more going, and he's gotten Washington, D.C. churned in a way that it hasn't before, and he's really trying to cut out the fat. So I'll give him credit for that. And he's also gotten a number of U.S. companies to do a U-turn at the border instead of taking companies out of the country to bring them back into the country, especially some of your auto companies. I think it was Walmart and Sam's. They are going to be creating 59 either building or expanding companies. So he's trying to get some things done, but you don't make promises that you can't keep. So he should learn a lesson there. And I'm sure that he's been quite disappointed in his own team when they set him out to dry with what happened with health care.
After 100 days, Simon, of course, the typical measure of a president, the average is in the sort of the mid-60s. He's in the low 40s in terms of approval right now. But there was that poll the other day that said that 96% of Donald Trump voters would vote for him again. There's no buyer's remorse. Is that how you're reading it?
I'm seeing different things in different polls. I've seen both of the numbers you quoted, but I just saw a Fox News report that said right now 32% of people said they'd vote for him at this point, and 50-something would vote for someone else. It wasn't asking specifically Trump voters again. Mm-hmm. You've got to remember, he wins with about 46% of the vote to begin with. Minor parties, he gets about 48.5% of the two-party vote. So he gets to the presidency without getting a majority of the popular vote. I tend to think if we were to average over all that polling that's out there at the moment, more people are with him than have left him. I think that 90-odd% number is perhaps the headline, that despite the outrage around the world and some of the outrage you see in the American media, that set of people that he turned out, the way he transformed the American electorate, the way he essentially stole the Republican nomination, those dynamics are still in place. He gave them the Supreme Court nomination that they wanted. That was perhaps the thing that a lot of evangelicals held their nose on and were prepared to vote for him anyway, despite his many other failings. And he has delivered on that. And I think it will take something quite stupendous to pry that hardcore base away from him. And in the meantime, I don't expect that 90% number may come down a little. The question is, it has to be very high again if he's to pull off the trick that he pulled off in 2016. If he's to win the presidency without winning a majority of the popular vote, then he's going to need every vote he got in 2016 and then some.
So, Damien, Simon mentioned there the appointment of Neil Gorsuch. How important was that as a factor for keeping Republicans, because more than 90% of Republicans ultimately voted for Donald Trump, even though he got a historically low proportion of the Republican vote to become their nominee? Lots of numbers there, but at the end of the day, a Conservative Supreme Court Justice, was that key?
Well, it's definitely the thing that everyone can point to as the victory. I mean, to some degree, I think you could argue that he's benefited from some of these failures. At the beginning with the immigration policy, for example, it looked like the country was about to have an enormous debate about its own identity, about whether or not it wanted to be a country that was international, that welcomed the poor and the needy from around the world or not. Striking that down allows a certain stasis to kind of remain, where the populace and the people who voted for him are more willing to give him a chance to keep trying. And so what I've sort of heard from a lot of Trump voters that I've talked to before I came to Australia, I'm a newcomer here, was that, you know, we need to give him more time. And so to some degree, these failures have bought him more time. And Gorsuch is the one thing they can point to and say, well, at least he did that.
Adam, we've seen just this week the President unveil broad outlines for what he would like to see coming out of a process of tax reform, quite similar to the broad outlines that he announced last year as a candidate. As a vote getter, do you think that tax brackets and so on really matter? And ultimately, if he gets the tax reform through, how useful an economic lever do you think that will be?
Look, just firstly on the first part, I think it's a widespread simplification of the US tax code, which is what is being proposed, would be a vote getter. I mean, it is one of the most complicated tax systems in the world. The conventional wisdom is that if you cut the corporate tax rate, you're going to get much faster economic growth. I think that is by and large true. The significant cuts to personal income tax rates, well, they would go from 39.6% being the top marginal rate to 35%. The jury is more out on that, and I think Republicans will get a lot of criticism for supposedly giving a tax cut to the rich, and that will play into various criticisms of Trump. And so that could become a problem, but there will be debate about the overall balance of those cuts and who it hits in coming weeks.
Now, Barb, you of course worked in the Carter White House, and the guy that kicked you out, Ronald Reagan, got elected promising tax cuts, big boost in military spending, and indeed to make America great again. He used that slogan. To what extent do you think that Donald Trump is now running a very orthodox domestic and economic policy to appeal to those old school Republican base?
Traditional is not a word I would ever use with Donald Trump, actually. But one of the things I think he's managing to do is to show that he's working, that he's trying to make some changes, and especially when it does come to jobs, by bringing business back and by really putting the hammer down on them, saying, you keep businesses here in America, or we're going to tax you again if you try to bring your goods back in. And so I think that is something that a lot of people wanted to hear. There's a possibility to go back to work again. So it's not traditional, and I think the public at large is still very much waiting in bay to see what he's going to do, and they're not sure about that because he is dicey.
If I could just jump in there. I mean, I do think on taxes and on the economics, there's a difference between tax cuts and creating jobs. And I think one of the great questions for the country at this point is, can the economy be stimulated just through trade? Or is there such a dynamic technological transformation that there's nothing the president can do to offset some of the changes that are hitting middle America? And so I think the jury's still out on that. And how much of a limitation he has, we'll just have to wait and see. And so I'm curious to see if the taxes are enough or if people are actually going to be expecting actual jobs, which might have come from infrastructure or some of the other things that he's basically decided not to do.
Simon, how much political capital is tied up to approval ratings? Is President Trump's leverage at the moment diminished because of those poll numbers? Or at the end of the day, the president's the president, and that office has tremendous power when it comes to persuading Congress and others?
Yeah, I think ordinarily you'd say a president with a 40% approval rating or 41, 42% approval rating this early in his presidency, that would be Exhibit A for low stock of political capital. I think the difference here is that we have to remember, at least nominally, Republicans have presidency, House, and Senate. He has enormous big proposals coming through, tax being one of them. It's going to be awfully hard for Republicans to vote no on that, although I think a lot of them may want to. He is Donald Trump, and so he is carrying around, and he's got the promises that brought him to office, and this tumultuous 100 days he's treated us to. This is as we heard in the earlier panel, anything but a conventional presidency. And for that reason, I think reading into him the way you would conventionally read in a 42% approval rating doesn't quite mean the same thing for Donald Trump as it might mean for another president. The last thing on that is to say that the House at the moment have to understand that because of redistricting, for one, plus perhaps some geographic polarization in American society, that Republican majority is extremely safe at the moment. And they may be willing to go along with things, few of them at risk from doing things that are quite unpopular. The unpopular move for some of them is not to go along with Trump, and they'll face a primary challenge on their right flank if they don't go along. So I think we need to, times have changed in two ways. A, we've got Donald Trump as president, but we've got a different looking Republican Congress that we may have had, say, in 1994 under Newt Gingrich, where a lot of those Republican House members have got much more of their own political capital and perhaps a little more room to go along with Trump or not, as the case may be.
Barb, of course, arguably the biggest domestic failure for President Trump in the first 100 days was the failure of the effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, not even getting to a vote in the House. In the lead up to this 100-day anniversary, there was another push to try and say that there's going to be some progress on this front. How important to Donald Trump's presidency is this do-over, and for Republicans' credibility as a majority party in Congress to do this?
Yeah. It's going to be a big deal. It'll be a big deal because, number one, his people sent him out to dry. And I think Paul Ryan should really get a good, they need to take him behind the barn for this one. I don't believe that Donald Trump had any idea that the Republicans were that ill-prepared. They whined and complained about health care right after Obama came out with it. He was 2.5 years in by then. And they had 5.5 years to get it right and blew it. And so they sent him out there and they didn't have anything. So that's going to be tough for him. I think the immigration piece, the wall, some of those other things, if he can achieve that, he'll be doing well. And he is going to get around, I think, to the infrastructure piece. If he had started with that, left health care alone, I don't know why they didn't, but who am I to say? He would be much better off today. So he stepped out on that one, and that killed him. And then he also had the judge in the Ninth Circuit in California who's trying to shut everything down he's doing on the borders. When it comes to the borders, I think this is an area that a lot of people do not understand. Both in Australia and America, most of them do not understand the lack of protection and the lack of control we have throughout the Southwest, or not the Southwest, but the southern states, Texas, Arizona, Southern California, because they judge our controls as most people, if you're leaving the country, you're going to be flying in, flying out. But if you are coming across one of those southern borders, you have holes in the fence or areas where there are no fences. So there, I think he'll be held accountable to build a wall, but he's not going to ever do 2,000 miles worth of wall. And besides, technology has changed. And if you build a wall up, what are they going to do? Crawl under? They've got tunnels coming in from Mexico now.
Right. So, Damien Cave, I mean, on the question of the wall, Barb mentions 2,000 miles, a long way, and then of course you can just sort of go around the end on the coast, and there's a big river there as well. First, Mexico was going to pay for it, then Mexico wasn't going to pay, and then Congress was going to pay for it, and then Congress said they weren't going to pay for it. We'll shut down the government, the Democrats said, instead of paying for this thing. Is the president, is this going to be a long-term problem with him, or does he just have to build a couple of miles, a very tall wall, do the photo opportunity, and people will go, mission accomplished?
I mean, I kind of think it's the latter. I'm a former Mexico correspondent. I spent a lot of time at that border. The physical inability to actually create a wall across that is without a doubt clear. So you have to take into account that reality. And for a lot of people, the wall, especially people who don't live near the border, who don't spend as much time there, it's an emotional thing. It's basically, we need to see the government trying to do something to prevent what they perceive to be a problem. Now listen, Mexican migration has gone down. This is basically fighting a battle that's 20 years old, that is no longer the crisis that he's presenting it to be, just factually. But for many people who live in communities far away from the border where they've seen immigration change their small towns and change their lives at a time where their own status and economic power has declined, this is an emotional, visceral issue about identity and power, and so the wall restores some of that. And so even just stretches that show that he's trying, I think will get him gains with his supporters. I think all of these policies many of his supporters simply want to see him trying to do these things. And to some degree, success or failure may not actually affect the support for him. What they want is to know that someone's on their side and fighting for what they're fighting for. And the wall represents a big symbol for that, whether it makes sense or not.
Adam, on the economic measures, the Wall Street has been booming since Trump was elected. Unemployment is at 10-year lows. And yet there is still the possibility of a trade war. Maybe not with that currency manipulator China, but maybe with Canada over timber imports into Wisconsin. There are all sorts of potential flashpoints here, trade barriers erected to try and bring businesses back and so on. How do you think business is going to continue to respond to Trump? Is it going to be positive, assuming that he's going to be spending big on stimulus and other things, or at some point will the sugar rush wear off?
Well, look, I think the sugar rush will wear off, and we're seeing signs of that already in the bond market, at least. The bond yields have started falling again. But part of the reason why the stock market exploded after the election was purely mechanical, because there was a promise to cut the corporate tax rate from 35% to 15%. And of course, a share is just a right to the flow of profits in the future. And so if the government's going to tax it less, then obviously the shares go up in value. Very basic, right? So, but also there was a huge increase in bond yields. And this is the more interesting phenomenon, I think, because we've had very, very low interest rates around the world, including in Australia, for a very long time now, at least since the financial crisis, basically, and they've started to go up again. So that raises the question, is this because growth is going to be faster in the future, that investors think that, or are they worried about the creditworthiness of the United States in the future? And that's why there's a sell-off in bonds, because you have to look at the fiscal situation of the US. I mean, it's extremely bad, right? I mean, one of the constraints on building the wall will actually be that they can't afford it because the US government's debt is already 75% of GDP. It's going to 100% of GDP. That actually excludes a lot of items. I mean, the US government is basically insolvent if you discount back to now the future revenues and the future expenses. It is a huge negative number, bits of Social Security, bits of Medicaid and so forth. And so at some point, and I think probably in this term, in this 4 years, serious questions are going to be raised about whether or not the US is going to be able to pay back these debts.
Would you please thank our domestic policy panellists? It's fair to say that President Donald Trump's first 100 days in dealing with the media has been different, as has his press secretary in the White House, Sean Spicer, as well. We're going to look at the role that the media has played in those first 100 days. Are they the opposition to the Trump administration? That's coming up, but first, some of the highlights.
I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news.
Fake news.
Fake. Phony. Fake.
Fake. Fake. Fake news.
Fake news, the fake news.
I do get good ratings, you have to admit that.
Since you're attacking us, can you give us a question?
No, not you. Not you. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you stay categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir.
We do know a few things, so let's go through the facts. This was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period.
Why did he do that? It undermines the credibility of the entire White House press office on day one.
Don't be so overly dramatic. Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts?
She could not even say it with a straight face. Alternative facts.
Welcome to the world of the media.
They're very smart, they're very cunning, and they're very dishonest.
Twitter is Trump's weapon of choice because every political reporter is on it and all the breaking news is there first.
Should I keep the Twitter going or not? Keep it going? I think so. You know, it's a way of bypassing dishonest media, right? We go, wow.
The more time you spend on Trump on, putting him out there, the more you help him.
The White House has just frozen out media organizations that President Trump has blasted as fake news.
The New York Times and CNN, among others, were excluded from today's press briefing.
One critic wrote, you know who else blocks the media? Putin. Just saying.
Quiet, quiet, quiet. Donald Trump rants and raves at the press. I'm not ranting and raving. I'm just telling you, you're dishonest people.
This is Donald Trump's first 100 days on ABC News and ABC RN. I'm John Barron, and we've got a bunch of journos to round out the discussion today. Joining us is former NBC correspondent and ABC contributor Sarah James. And the Australians Adam Crichton and Damien Cave from the New York Times are still with us as well. Let's go to you first, Sarah, because you've covered Donald Trump over a number of years, it's fair to say. You've seen the way he works with and works the media. Is there method to this very combative kind of relationship that he's fostered?
Oh yeah, it's very clever. I think there's no question that if you're getting media that you're not fond of, that blaming the messenger, in this case those of us in media, is really a clever strategy. And working as I do for NBC, you know, we get an opportunity to see this up close and personal. I mean, really, I'd call them terms of endearment. You know, fake news, failing news, enemy of the people. I mean, these are, you know, basically kisses to the media, aren't they? But here's
he says the New York Times is failing.
Yes.
And yet he's on the phone to them.
Damien, how you doing over there, buddy?
All I can say is that whenever he says the New York Times is failing, our subscriptions go up.
Well, and this is what's so interesting. And you know, I'm at NBC, so sleepy-eyed Chuck Todd at Meet the Press is also doing really, really well. And here's another interesting aspect of it. You know, CNN actually got worried enough because they were singled out many times as really sort of fake news. And they actually ran, you know, they did some polling to figure out where they actually stood. And what they discovered was that among the people who are watching them, they know they're not fake news. So we're in a very interesting time because what we're finding, I think, in the United States is that messaging is going to particular bases. So the Trump base, who really hasn't been particularly happy, and there are reasons to understand why that might be the case, they're really pleased with some of these terms. This really plays well to that base. And then the people who are actually cross about this presidency and really not happy, and that's a big number too, they are seeing it in a very different way. So it's quite a polarized and divided country at the moment.
So, Damien, they used to say back in the days of William Randolph Hearst, never pick a fight with somebody that buys ink by the barrel. It's a bad idea. Donald Trump keeps picking these fights, and it got him elected. How's he doing this?
Well, I mean, I do think that there is a benefit for his supporters. I mean, I do think that the media is an easy punching bag. I think the media has been imperfect and has often been out of touch, frankly, and the way we cover politics is far from perfect as an industry. And I think this allows him to kind of use us as a punching bag. But, you know, by the same token, I think in a lot of ways it's reinvigorated the press and made us kind of involve our, you know, create some self-reflection, and then kind of really dive into what we think we need to be doing, and also to recognize that, you know, we need to do a better job of explaining what we do and why it's valuable.
Well, what are those major pitfalls? Because a lot of reporters have been trying to work out in this last 100 days, or last 2 years really, how should we cover a guy who says things that are provocative, sometimes outrageous, even completely wrong, and yet they deserve the respect of the office that they're seeking or indeed have attained?
Well, I do think you're starting to see a recognition. I mean, for a long time, the New York Times is a big institution, and institutions cover institutions a certain way. But I think what you're starting to see is a journalism that kind of comes back to a reality-based world, where you see an untruth and you call it out. You don't sort of let it go into the 10th paragraph. In the second paragraph, you say, there's no evidence to support this claim. Or you'll see headlines. I mean, we had a headline that specifically called out a lie by the president. That's pretty unprecedented for something like the New York Times. And so I think that there is a kind of change kind of happening in the way we interact with power that ultimately, I hope, will be healthy for democracy. And so I think, you know, we'll sort of see how this goes. But just to give you one quick example of sort of in the trenches what it feels like, I happened to be in Cuba covering the death of Fidel Castro soon after President Trump was elected, and I was writing a story about the funeral of Castro, and then suddenly a tweet came out from President Trump. And me and my editors were immediately trying to figure out how to work in or deal with the fact that there was suddenly this tweet out there from the President of the United States about Cuba policy. Was it accurate? Was it something that should be read into, or something that should just be dismissed? And so, especially in the early days with this president, I think the media was really struggling and trying to figure out how to adjust to this new presidency. I do think, at least at the New York Times, we've really found our footing. I think that, you know, us, the Washington Post, a handful of other outlets are really kind of digging in a way that is, I think, very exciting as a journalist to see. And so we'll kind of see how it plays out.
Adam, we've seen presidents in the past rail against certain columnists or media outlets. Barack Obama liked to hit Fox News with a stick from time to time. But President Trump seems to have gone further in terms of really seeking to delegitimise the mainstream media at a time when sections of the mainstream media have also been questioning his legitimacy as well. What is the end game here? Who wins?
Well, I think the irony of the situation is that ultimately, again, it plays into the hands of the established mastheads. With the proliferation of fake news and so forth, ultimately people will want to go to sources where they know the facts will be correct, or at least where some effort has been made to ensure the facts are correct. Of course, facts are correct, but and so I think that is going to benefit the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Australian here, and indeed we're seeing it with the subscriptions. It's not just in the US, but in Australia as well. All of the newspapers got a big bounce in their subscriptions in the wake of November, which is quite remarkable, and they've been going up ever since. So Trump has been a great gift to the media, I think, both because of the story itself and just in a pure financial sense, he's also been a gift to the media.
I do think that there is a question, which is that growth for the choir that already believes a certain thing? I think at the Times and elsewhere, we're really trying to figure out ways to make sure that we're speaking to an entire broad and diverse audience. And I think that's an important question too. I mean, how do we sort of make sure that we don't just speak to individual camps? And so you've seen a lot of different approaches in an effort to kind of make sure that we're covering the entire range of voices and spectrums that we need to be doing.
Well, and that's an interesting point too, because one of the things that we know is some of the people who support Trump, they actually ignore what's happening on NBC or at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Australian. And what they're doing is they're going directly to Donald Trump's Twitter feed. I mean, he has millions of followers, and I think it's really interesting to understand and appreciate that this is a man with a real mastery of media. I covered Donald Trump's wedding to Marla Maples in 1993 for the Today Show in the United States. Now, I'm just going to give you a tip. We didn't cover a lot of weddings on the Today Show. So this was a man who was so skilled at figuring out how to get coverage. I mean, when he started dating Marla Maples while he was married to Ivana Trump, he was on the front page of the New York Post for 8 days in a row. This was unprecedented. So this is a man where the people who are covering him now, some of them were, in kindergarten. He was rocking it in New York and knew how to get covered, how to get his message through. So he has had years to hone those skills and abilities. So it's the combination of the messenger, who's highly skilled, and then he's thought about the message, and he's thought about the types of issues that reach some people who felt disenfranchised, who felt like they were not being listened to, and that's a potent combination, and we're learning how to cover it.
It seems, in terms of learning how to cover Donald Trump, it seems, Sarah, that sometimes the media is too easily distracted. Sure, it's a fire hose of news coming from the White House, from the Twitter feed and so on. But when the president can, with a single tweet, accusing his predecessor, Barack Obama, of being a bad, brackets, or sick person for wiretapping him as a way of stopping everybody talking about potentially lies told by the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, about discussions he had with the Russian ambassador. I mean, can the media kind of get off that sort of bright, shiny object fixation and stay on a story, or do they just have to keep rolling with the narrative?
I actually think that was an important tweet to cover, and I think it was, it led to, I think it was revealing about that presidency. And I think as well with this president, we have a president who, we know this again from going back to the 90s when I was in New York covering news there for NBC, and also going back to the 80s. This is a president whose stock and trade is attack, 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 never apologize, never retreat, move on, pivot, move on. And that's the piece. So it's partly the fire hose of all these things, I guess like the movie Up, ball. I mean, I get that. But more than that, I think it's us. We've had our own 100 days, I think, as journalists, where we're coming up to speed with a maverick, very skilled politician, small p politician. He might not have been elected before, but he's very good at politics and figuring out how to do that job. And I think we're getting smarter at it. I hope
Damien,
so.
the House Intelligence Committee, the FBI, everybody says there is no evidence that Barack Obama wiretapped Trump Tower. And yet, a poll this week showed that 35% of Americans believe that Barack Obama wiretapped Donald Trump. You talk about the generation of fake news. It can be done in 140 characters or less.
Well, I mean, I also think there's an echo chamber and a repetition factor that comes with social media and the way that media has been changed over time that can create a third of the country to believe a certain thing. But, you know, I also think that this is, you know, I don't know, I feel like this is working its way out, and, you know, there's only so much of this that kind of can play out quickly over time. You know, once you start to see policies and impacts, I think the type of coverage changes. You know, once there are things and real people who are affected as opposed to something that's just blocked immediately by the courts, I think the conversation deepens. And so we're still in this phase of trying to figure out, it's a lot about messaging, but at some point it's going to be about impacts. And that's when the journalism deepens, and that's when the conversation deepens as well.
Do you think focusing on the policy is an important lesson here, Adam?
Yeah, look, I just think the shock value of Trump's tweets is fading already, I think, because there's just so many of them, and we would just expect that. And I think people see him as being kind of a playful individual. He's not like normal politicians. So, you know, when he lies or says bad things, people do kind of forgive him for that because they see that as his nature. And if people want to know the truth, as I said earlier, they can go to the Journal or the New York Times and, you know, find the truth and find the actual facts. So, you know, if some people will believe things that aren't true, you're never going to be able to change that anyway.
Finally, Sarah James, this weekend, it's Nerd Prom in Washington, D.C., the White House Correspondents Association dinner, where typically every president since, I think, Richard Nixon has turned up to be roasted, but also to give a good-natured, self-deprecating speech. Donald Trump has decided instead he's going to give a campaign-style rally in Pennsylvania at exactly the same moment as the White House Correspondents' Dinner is going on. What does that tell you about the relationship between the two, and potentially who's winning this battle?
Oh, I think it's clever. I think it's a smart strategy. Again, I think we're seeing him create his own playbook. And I think, you know, I have got my T-shirt that says #journalist. I'm really, I love being a journalist right now. I think it's great, but I think we've got to be smart. I think that old just the facts is really an important way. I think we call out the stuff that's right and the stuff that's wrong. I think that nobody has a lot of patience for the village scold. They don't want to see us shake our finger. People are smart. And one of the things that we want to do is respect everyone out there and know that they're smart enough. If we lay out the facts, people can draw their own conclusions. If we do that, we're doing our job right. It's kind of old-fashioned, but I think that's, you know, we're talking Nerd Prom. You know, kind of old-fashioned, and let Trump, President Trump, be President Trump and go his own way and call out the stuff. I think he's very smart.
Would you please thank Sarah James, Adam Crichton, and Damien Kay. Now it's our turn to hear from you. We've got some time to take some of your questions. I know there's a lot of people here that follow their American politics very closely, a lot of people that have studied or are studying at the US Studies Centre as well. So we're really interested to hear from you.
My question is about the President's conflicts of interest, which seem quite significant. And I suppose I'm wondering, do you think that they will remain an issue of interest, or is it just going to become acceptable and have an impact on norms going forward?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good question. The coverage of the conflicts of interest, I think, is really starting to ramp up, and so you're starting to kind of see a lot more in-depth coverage of it. And so I do think the question is whether or not an audience will tune out or will continue to kind of see problems with this. And to some degree, I think it will, again, kind of play out over time. If these conflicts of interest lead to significant enrichment for Trump and a bunch of, not just his family, but a whole bunch of other, you know, people around him, and the base of his voters who feel like the system was already rigged against them, and this suddenly plays into that same idea that now there's a whole other group of people for whom it's rigged, then I do think that there's the potential for it to have a larger impact. I mean, Americans, you know, do believe in a certain degree of fairness, and there is, this election was in part an expression of frustration with an economy that has become increasingly unequal and increasingly unfair. And so I think that there's a real risk of that sticking to Donald Trump more than he or his, you know, very wealthy group of advisors may recognize yet.
Adam, do you think that the American voters that put Donald Trump in office care about what might be a technical or perceived conflict of interest, or have they really accepted that this guy is a one-man brand, and that's part of the package they bought into?
Well, certainly the conflicts did seem breathtaking when you first kind of read about them, but I think most voters, they assume, and rightly probably, that most politicians have a range of conflicts of interest. So they all have conflicts of interest. You know, Trump's are no greater necessarily than anyone else's. You don't know what a politician is thinking at any one time or why he or she is making a decision. And so I think that's why the effectiveness of the attacks on his so-called conflicts of interest, and of course, you know, like I'm not saying that they're not there, that they are, they weren't effective. I mean, he still won, even though seemingly they're shocking. So I think people are basically trusting him, and it's a potentially great political liability for Trump. I mean, if he is caught blatantly enriching himself, then that is going to be devastating. But I don't think he's going to do that because that would be crazy politically.
Sarah, it's not as if Donald Trump even has to be caught enriching himself. His name is on hotels and office towers around the world, and their value goes up as a result.
Well, this is an interesting one. And again, I think everyone was prepared for the fact that with the maverick running for the President of the United States, who was coming from the position of having been a business person with real estate interests around the globe, that it was going to be a little bit different. I think one thing that we might have missed here is that in the United States, there's kind of a tradition of almost a honeymoon period for the president. And, you know, that's kind of, it's not quite synonymous with those first 100 days, but there is a period of time where everybody kind of goes, okay, we're going to watch this president start. So what I would say is stay tuned. You know, as you ramp into, we are only 100 days, not even 1/3 of the way through the first year of a 4-year presidency. As things start, as things start to play out, watch for the shark action to reassert itself. There are a fair number of dorsal fins in Washington, D.C., and you'll see them start to surface if they see blood in the water.
We've got another question.
Damien just mentioned Trump's advisors, which is actually what my question is about. We've seen some ups and downs in some of his the advisors that are working for and with him, whether that's Kellyanne Conway, who seems to have disappeared lately, or Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, now Jared Kushner's gigantic portfolio, Ivanka Trump being given a role in the White House. So my question is this just a revolving door of ideologues and know-nothings, or is there something else going on?
I've had a bunch of long conversations with some of our White House correspondents for the New York Times, and one of the things that I think emerges is the degree to which his advisors are really learning on the job. I mean, when you elect a maverick president and he surrounds himself with a bunch of people who come from business and family, these are people that in many cases really need to get their heads around how government works simply. And so there's a learning curve that is then combined with Trump's taste for a competitive environment, right? And so you have people up and down. There's some encouragement of that by the president, but then there's also always the threat of him being angry at you. And so people, the sort of degree of intense competition seems to be greater, in part because of the nature of this White House. And then there's simply shortages of staffing to some degree. And so there's all kinds of unfilled slots. And so all of this kind of combines to create what appears to be a very chaotic environment. And so, you know, a revolving door, I don't know, I doubt you're going to see Ivanka or Jared be going anywhere. And so, you know, I actually see, at least from my outside perspective now, it seems like there's a small group of people who are trusted, and the bigger question is, who are sort of speaking for this administration? Like, that seems to be a revolving door. And so who is Trump happy with presenting his message, besides himself, who he's clearly in love with his own messengers? You know, that's a question that I think is still kind of unknown, and you'll see a lot of people cycle through, I suspect.
Sarah James.
I agree with that, and I would add to that I think the people that historically President Trump has been the most comfortable with are his family. And that has always been his go-to, his source of strength and support. He really trusts his family. And there's almost, you know, going back, you talk about the Kennedy presidency, the Camelot name gets bandied about, but there's a certain royal quality to this presidency, with the family really in such a significant position of power. And again, that's something that we haven't seen in quite the same way. We've certainly had some before, but there's a bigger stake there, and greater portfolios for some of these family members.
We've seen a lot of change in how politicians use Twitter and other social media in the last few years. Do you think that journalists, analysts and so on will have to rethink essentially their playbook in media relations with politicians and with administrations in the future?
Certainly Twitter has made politicians more powerful because they can communicate directly now, and it's kind of weakened our power from because people don't have to read us to find out what's going on in Canberra or whatever. They can just look at Malcolm Turnbull's Twitter feed, and as he said before, he's got more followers than the Financial Review, indeed, probably more than all our newspapers put together. And indeed, Trump has 25 million, more than Australia's population. Will it change the way? Well, I mean, I think what it's doing is there's a greater emphasis in the media on kind of analysis and commentary now, as opposed to just kind of reporting what happened, because you don't need journalists for that anymore. You can go and find that out on Twitter or indeed on a free website. So.
Yeah, I would argue that it's already changed the relationship pretty significantly, right? But it does create a push towards other kinds of journalism. And so in addition to analysis and commentary, which I think there's more of that probably in the Australian media than there is in the American media, I think it's also creating a real desire for more investigative journalism in the United States. And that's something that I think we hope to do more of in Australia and elsewhere at the Times. And I feel like that's another way that it's changing. And this will sort of continue too. But then I also feel like, there was a lot of value to having all these journalists in a capital covering the daily events. And so if that becomes a little less needed and less valuable to the average news consumer, what else can we give people to make it clear that what we're doing is important to their lives? And so that, I think, is a question that the entire journalistic community is trying to figure out.
And we also have to add into that mix the genuine fake news, if I can use that term, that occurred in this election, which was the fake news stories that were being spread, and that many of which went viral, that we know were absolutely just completely made up. And so one of the aspects of social media, and this has been talked about at Facebook and Google, and there's been a lot of soul searching and rending of garments and beating of chests at the end of this election, was how do we catch those things? How do we keep that from kind of proliferating almost like a virus and spreading everywhere? And so that's one area that I think we're all having to kind of take stock of. And, as we know, there is an ongoing investigation into what disinformation was coming in from the Russians. So this whole social media picture is quite a large landscape, and there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack.
Just to add one more thing, I mean, I also sometimes wonder, trying to look toward the future, if you have an environment where everyone has the capability to share, does it encourage those government officials that have documents, that have something to share that maybe they're not seeing in their Twitter stream, want to reach out to you and give you information? What you're starting to do is create a vested interest for people to start communicating with the media and communicating directly with an audience, so that it may be a little bit of letting the genie out of the bottle. What may initially serve the leadership, the presidents and the prime ministers, may ultimately undermine them in ways that they haven't even figured out.
My question is, what is your take on World War III, given the...
Well, where does it start? Which place?
Let's pass the roving mic to one of our Where Does World War III Start experts, Ashley Townsend. Your expert being in the Asian realm, Ashley.
I certainly hope and don't think it will begin on the Korean Peninsula. I think that, look, at the moment you have two leaders that are talking a very big game and a strategic environment that hasn't changed for a number of years. North Korea, we've known for at least a decade, was intent on developing intercontinental ballistic missiles and weapons to deliver nuclear weapons that could hit the United States. We've also known that the timeline was probably going to come around now and that it would be on someone's watch. What's changed is that we know that that's President Trump's. But the strategic environment, which is that North Korea has the capacity to seriously damage Seoul with conventional weapons that really can't be stopped in response to an American strike. That hasn't changed. So if you like, the United States can talk a big game about a preemptive strike, but they can't disarm Seoul completely. Even if they could disarm North Korea, even if they could hit all of its nuclear weapons, they couldn't stop its conventional artillery. So this is the basic problem for any American military solution. that hasn't changed. Now, the only thing that could change would be China's preferences, and this is where the administration is really trying to have an impact. They believe that they could try and get Beijing to not value proliferation of nuclear weapons in North Korea below stability in North Korea. Right now, Beijing cares most about making sure that the regime in Pyongyang doesn't collapse. If they can get Beijing to care a little bit more about non-proliferation and put more pressure on Pyongyang, maybe that will be an effect there. But look, whether or not that happens, the likelihood of either side to strike first is quite low. So you might see an American strike on a missile test, one that would shoot down a North Korean missile, but not one that would hit North Korea itself. And in that sense, I think when you have the Vice President talking about strikes in Syria and Afghanistan, showing that this administration means business, and then linking that to the situation on the Korean Peninsula, you're seeing a very public game of brinksmanship and of bluff. And both sides know that the United States really can't strike North Korea.
Okay, so no World War III over the Korean Peninsula, but Grana Gergich, surely it's going to start in Ukraine or over Crimea.
I actually doubt that, but I don't know. Hopefully it doesn't happen, and then you replay this and kind of show it to me in a year's or so time. I would say, well, in terms of Russia's near abroad, Putin has been proven to be an opportunist, and he uses these situations where he could insert himself where, you know, the polity is basically either divided or unstable, or there's some sort of transition going on, and this is how he basically got into Ukraine very skillfully. But he knows his limits, I think. I don't think, you know, we haven't seen what a lot of people were saying, that we would see maybe Putin going all the way to Kiev. He hasn't. He actually benefits from these sort of frozen conflicts where, you know, the situation is unstable enough, but not to kind of push it over the brink. But with regards to your question of the kind of world war, I mean, we are probably not going to see a conventional war that we have seen in the first half of the 20th century. The means of military engagement have changed, obviously, and you're seeing cyber warfare basically all around the shop, right? The fact that we are now taking for granted the fact that Russia is actively targeting, you know, not just United States, but France now. We're talking about stepping up engagement in Germany. Those are very provocative actions. That's one thing. The other thing, what's been going on in the Middle East is akin to a world war of sorts, right? You have the kind of conflict dyads within that started as civil wars, but soon grew into kind of regional wars, and now you have the involvement of also major powers, which seemingly, you know, signals that we are out of the standard kind of instability that characterizes just civil wars and the way that it affects neighborhoods. Obviously, US has been stepping up in the Middle East, its involvement, so again, and Russia being present there, that gives you some sort of hints as to, you know, the kind of dynamics that are going on.
And Sarah James, do you expect to be digging out the flak jacket and going to cover World War III sometime soon?
I certainly hope not. But one thing I was going to just add as we're talking about this is I reported on Vice President Pence's trip here. I reported on that for NBC. And one of the aspects that really struck me over the course of the time that the Vice President was here in Australia was that he definitely said all options are on the table in terms of North Korea, but he continued to bring back, you know, we're hoping for peaceful, diplomatic. So you're hearing these messages, and it's important to remember that while in the United States, of course, the president is also the commander-in-chief, that there are career people, both in State Department, in defense, obviously, and these other enormously important departments that are involved in all of these. And they war game and plan for all of this for many, many years. So while administrations change, and while I wouldn't begin to say that a president can or can't do a particular thing, of course that can happen, but that there are people who are planning things for many, many years and laying out strategies and protocols, and And that's important to remember in this as we discuss this.
I also saw the same thing when Tillerson went and met with Putin. He had to wait 2 hours, but he was really, giving the olive leaf there when he said that we need to work together, we will resolve this together. And there was a new tone of inclusiveness, the same thing as Pence, to really try to see if we can find a way we're going to try our best to resolve it peacefully as opposed to a war.
So go ahead.
We've spoken about the reduction in the State Department's funding. I was just wondering about the reduction in the EPA and the heading of the EPA by a climate denialist. We've also had President Trump come out and flatly deny climate change exists. It's a Chinese misnomer. I'm wondering what withdrawal from the Paris Agreement will lead to for climate change leadership within the international community.
Damien, it has been an interesting development, the President effectively declaring an end to what he called the war on coal and looking to cut back on a lot of regulatory powers that the EPA has. Is it going to have a significant difference?
I mean, it seems to. I mean, one of the first big stories I did when I got here was about the death of the Great Barrier Reef in all kinds of areas. And climate change is something that I think plays out all around the world. And when there isn't leadership on that issue, the status quo continues. And as scientists will tell you, the status quo is not good for the Earth at this point. And so, I do think this empowers a community of people who are in the business of denying that, or at least, diminishing it. I think there's arguments to be made about the degree, the severity, and how much adaptation can occur. But this is definitely a very dramatic change. I mean, the Trump administration is very clearly laying out the groundwork for a complete gift to fossil fuel industry and a complete shift in the focus of energy policy.
Do you think, Adam, that therefore the United States will have an advantage because they'll keep using coal and oil shale and so on for another 4 to 8 years? Or do their rivals like China and India and others have an advantage because they're moving towards renewables at a more aggressive rate now?
Well, maybe the rate is more aggressive, but the reality is that coal and oil and gas for the next 50 years are going to be the vast bulk of the source of energy for the world. Indeed, I just looked at BP's forecast yesterday, and by 2035, renewables will only provide, on current rates of growth, 10% of the world's energy, and coal and gas will each be about 30 or 40%. Okay, the shares are falling off slightly, but the reality is that India and China are either using fossil fuels to power themselves or building nuclear reactors. Just more focused on the US, it was the shale gas boom that sustained a mini kind of bounce in the manufacturing sector there and did provide some jobs. So, I think Trump has sensed, and I'm sure in private Trump would actually agree with climate change. I mean, he used to be a Democrat, right? I mean, I'm sure he thinks it's happening, but this is fantastic politics, right? And it really appeals to his base because people see it as just something that is not necessarily wrong, but something that is maybe talked about too much or is exaggerated, at least in the view of ordinary voters, I think.
There were, however, of course, the marches for science that took place in the United States, and indeed there were marches here in Australia and elsewhere. So there is pushback from many in the United States on this issue. And indeed, an interesting thing is playing out in the U.S. The U.S. has a famous tension between the states and the federal government. And so any number of states, I give you California, New York, among others, and indeed major metropolitan areas are saying, we are actually going to pursue our own paths in terms of clean air, clean water, and other issues. So there's really a tension that's playing out in the United States on this particular issue.
I want to echo the federal-state tension, but laid over on that in the United States is also the effect of actors in civil society, and that includes, of course, the corporate sector and universities. There are plenty of other actors aggressively pursuing, a post-fossil fuel future in the United States, perhaps despite or in reaction to what may be going on at the federal level. And I think as important an actor as the government of the United States is, right, perhaps the most very powerful actor on the planet, there's an awful lot else going on in American society at scales that I think would overwhelm many Australians at first glance. The California story is one, but also the commitment by individuals, enterprises, and other institutions right up and down American society on this particular issue, and many others besides, by the way. But the private sector's response on climate change is a big part of the American story, and something I think it's very easy to forget about as we rightly perhaps focus on what's happening in DC. There's a lot more to the story.
I wanted to ask really quickly whether the panel feels that Facebook and Google, given how widely they're used, are doing enough to A, combat low-quality news, and also B, promote high-quality original journalism from organizations like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NBC News, and so on.
We'd like a lot more promotion, of course. But no, I mean, I think there's a question that should be posed to the technology companies in terms of what their role is in democracy. I think that they're kind of starting to realize that maybe what they thought they were as a business is not the only thing they are, that they are information distributors, they are in many ways a press. But I also think that the audience has a responsibility too. You know, I think that we all sometimes live in our worlds where we only speak to people who agree with us. And I think that there has to be, you know, these algorithms are written to give us more of what we want, but we all have the free will to be able to try and learn from people who are different from us. And so I actually think while these technology companies, yes, they have a responsibility, I'm glad they're pursuing it, and I hope they continue to pursue it, and I hope that our story is at the top of every search that everyone in this room ever makes. You know, I also think that the journalism community needs to do better too, and I think the readership community needs to do better as well.
Adam, how concerned are you at the idea of Facebook and Google becoming gatekeepers for truth? How much responsibility should we be placing on them as opposed to our own discretion as information consumers?
It's a very good question, and I think it's a very worrying question, I think. I mean, these two companies, especially Google, they probably have maybe more power than kind of any private company has ever had, really, in a sense. I mean, the ability to filter information and to rank searches is incredible. And I think we're only starting to see the ramifications of that now, and I think ultimately governments are going to have to make a decision. You know, this is not very free market of me, but when you have an entity that just has so much political power, really, ultimately, and kind of knowledge of how they sort their news stories, I mean, it does raise questions of whether it's a monopoly or whether it needs to be broken up in some way. You know, these are deep questions, and because Google's a fairly new phenomenon, we don't know the answer to it yet, but I do think that both companies should do more to distinguish genuine news sources, and I'm sure they have the capability to do so. You know, they have the best business model in the world, basically, Google. I mean, they have all this content, and they don't pay anything for it.
You know what's tricky, though, is, you know, these information superhighways have also made our journalism accessible in ways it never was. It's easier to read the New York Times around the world than it's ever been. Yeah. We have more readers than we've ever had in our history. And so I think it's you know, it's much more complicated than it initially seems. I mean, it's easy to demonize them. I was a tech reporter in San Francisco at one point, and, like, you know, I saw this at the early days. And so, but I think this is all part of a process where everyone's trying to sort of figure out, well, okay, how do we hold them accountable? And, you know, if it's government, who gets to choose which is a high quality source or not? Do you really want your government choosing that? You know, so I don't know. I think this is a tough question that everyone, as consumers of news and as people who care about the world, we kind of need to work through together.
Sarah, what is your take on the role that Facebook and Google played in the so-called fake news phenomenon, when people were consuming and sharing stories from newspapers that didn't exist, with if not fake content, certainly fake headlines that sort of said, you know, Hillary Clinton running child sex ring out of a pizza parlor and so on. Some would argue that people are sharing those things not because they really believe it, because they want to believe it, or they don't like Hillary Clinton, so they're happy to say this thing. It's like spreading malicious gossip when you know it's not even true, but gee, it feels good to do it.
I think they got caught flat-footed, frankly, and I think they're looking back at it and saying, we have to do better. I think that's what happened. But I think that was true pretty broadly. I think most of us didn't quite see it coming. You know, funnily enough, my own Facebook page was interesting. It was more multifaceted. It wasn't a complete echo chamber. I was seeing different voices because I've moved, I've lived in different regions of the country, you know, I have a diverse group of friends, and I was seeing different voices percolate, and yet You know, it's sometimes hard to see what's coming down the pike. And I think if we pull that up more broadly, we're living in a time of enormous change on so many levels, and it's part of the reason I think that things happened in the United States in the way they did. I think there's an instinct to just go, whoa, stop. I need a minute to wait, and it isn't happening. It's not going to happen. So I think for all of us, there's opportunities to look back and say, maybe we didn't do that as well as we could. How do we do better? And if we're smart and we're careful, I think we're always looking for ways that we can do it better.
All right, we've got time for one last question. Over here.
So my question is for Guarana and others, and it's notwithstanding Pence's trip to Australia and Trump's recent rhetoric, I wonder whether or not allies in the region, such as Australia, Japan and others, do they view American security guarantees as still credible in light of the America First sort of rhetoric of the campaign?
I think despite the fact that Donald Trump is a maverick, I think it's also true that the American national interest, you know, is understood as something that is in line with the Australian national interest to a large degree. And to the extent that that's true, then it doesn't matter who's in the White House. Yes, we may have a President Trump who perhaps is more candid in his assessment, shall we put it that way, who mispronounces your prime minister's name almost on purpose and almost with delight. I think we'll see that kind of thing, but at the end of the day, right, I think that the enduring intersection of national interest between Australia and the United States will endure. Now, the question, of course, is what America will drag Australia into. And I think, you know, as an outside observer, I think that is very worrisome for Australia. It may be necessary then for Australia to think about how it could distance itself from certain actions that the United States is undertaking without jeopardizing that alliance. But yet, I think Australia is up to that. After all, President Trump knows that he's not just ruffled enemies, he's also ruffled allies. And so I think straight talk from Prime Minister Turnbull to President Trump will be extremely helpful. Just as Trump can be candid with Turnbull, Turnbull can be candid with Trump.
You know, it's true that the alliance commitments in Asia are in the interests of both sides and are seen to be credible. But that doesn't mean that allies aren't worried about a president that appears to be trading horses when it comes to, let's say, North Korea policy, US-China relations. Allies have noted that Trump is willing to link things like a better trade deal on North Korea, with China for dividends on North Korea. The same has been said also about the South China Sea, the status of Taiwan, trade and currency policy more generally when it comes to China. So this approach, this transactional approach, does make allies concerned about what else might this president trade away. What other interests in the region might we see this president be interested in negotiating down for his own America First interests? And that's something that is always a negotiation between allies, but I think Donald Trump has shown that he's particularly likely to trade some things certain countries, especially Taiwan, are not willing to give. More broadly, I think it's worth noting that this president has not necessarily treated all allies in the same way, or at least allies don't see the president all in the same way. As Valerie mentioned, Australians are very concerned about the prospect of being drawn into a crisis. But in Japan, right next to China, with much more sort of daily security crises that could erupt between the China and the Japanese, the fear of abandonment is more acute. So Japan is willing to go much further and invest more in their relationship, in their alliance with the United States right now. In fact, Shinzo Abe's administration, which has been looking for ways to deepen and expand defense spending and change its constitution to allow for that, sees the Trump administration as somewhat of an opportunity. And that's fine for Japan. But for Australia-Japan relations and for relations between Asian allies, that can create some rifts. When Australia is trying to stand back from some of the potentially more destabilising policies that this administration may choose to take, Japan might be more willing to go along. And so that can create second and third order rifts in the alliance network, which can have lasting effects.
And on that note, we are right out of time. Would you please thank our panel of experts tonight?